Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. Today, the much-anticipated conversation with Mathew Gibson, a listener with quite a few questions, and some update news associated with my travels to the UK, and a little thing let's call Fighting Fantasy Fest 3, coming up in August. Or listen more on the My Rules Are Better podcast. A week or so ago, I had a conversation with Mathew Gibson. Here is the audio. Hello, Mathew.
Hello, Tom.
I gave you a little bit of homework last time, or you set yourself a little bit of homework. So before we start on the formalities, would you like to give your project report to the class, please?
Well, we had a D&D session today, and I did have a chance to speak with them and ask them what it was they liked about the game. They were very quick to respond and very clear on their thoughts.
Wonderful.
One of which was that they love how the world is so open. The game doesn't have too many constraints, and they love that they could be who they wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
And really, that's, I guess, what a lot of people are drawn to in these games, you know, the opportunity to, just as the title says, role play. The other thing that was interesting was that we came to the end of a long adventure that began when we started playing and came to its conclusion this evening. And it was tense and it was fun and there was lots of engagement. And so then I said, so we have to think about, are we going to keep playing? And their answers were very quick. Absolutely. Which is terrific. And then I also said, going forward, think about, do we want to change up who's in charge or who's the storyteller and throw it open and leave that doorway open for them to step in to that role of kind of leading an adventure. And so we'll see. And that would be the ultimate compliment, I think, to me.
Certainly.
As a GM, that someone else would want to keep playing and also step into that role. We'll see.
Certainly. Well, and also have you assume the role of a player, potentially.
I would hope so.
Yes.
I even said, you don't have to keep playing with me. If you guys just want to do your own thing.
The door is open.
Please don't step through, but the door is open.
Very good. Interesting. So in terms of the conclusion, does it mean that there will be another get-together, another discussion, and then the game will resume potentially with a new GM? Although it sounds... no one rushed forward based on that initial comment, though.
No, I think that I've planted the seed, and they'll stew it over. Some people don't ever want to be GMs, I don't think, and that's fine.
Yes.
I know that my son is keen to do so at some point,
yes.
And I suspect one of the girls may want to.
Certainly.
One of them is a writer of fiction, and so the idea of guiding a story, I think, would be attractive to her. Yeah. And you'll be pleased to know that when the adventure had concluded and we had some time left, they were all very keen to try their hand at painting miniatures.
Wonderful.
I thought you'd like that. Yeah,
Very
so
good.
We got out paints and the brushes and picked some figurines, and they were very enthusiastic.
People talk about hip-hop as being a musical form with graffiti and obviously dancing and streetwear. I think of role-playing as very similar, that the miniatures and everything that comes along with it, perhaps, an interest in armor, perhaps an interest in medieval history, all these kind of bits and pieces, but I think they all come together beautifully. And yet, to have one part but not the other, I think is very similar to the hip-hop purists that say that it needs to be all these things together. So I'm glad the miniatures and the paints came out.
Myself as well, and I'm glad that they're looking at the other ways to be creative with the genre. There was another nice compliment. We were compliment to everyone really in the session, and to everyone who enjoys this pastime. As I often do, at the beginning of the session, I say, "Okay, so someone want to kind of recap what happened last time because 2 weeks had passed," and in the describing of it, the person made it clear how much they'd enjoyed the previous adventure and the kind of the magic of it, and describing the great crystal cave they'd gone into and the different components of it, and none of which, of course, I don't present a visual. I'm not an artist. I don't present beautiful pieces of artwork to back up the worlds that I create or the storylines and things. And so this is all something that I was effectively able to describe it. They were able to imagine in their heads, right? And I'm sure their particular vision was slightly different to mine, slightly different to the next person's. But the fact that I helped to create this amazing landscape they filled with adventure, that's a big compliment, I think, to everyone.
I was reading an old comic book, maybe from the mid-'80s, a few months ago, and I posted it to Facebook, a photograph of a Dragonlance Chronicle ad. And it was associated with a module, so it was a Dragonlance Chronicle module. And I said, back then when the graphics card was your mind, and that seemed to be very receptive to a lot of people, this notion that, and it's funny actually to think that, I mean, one of the things that when I lived in the UK, I would talk to my co-workers periodically about the Dark Ages. And they had a very, Blackadder-esque view of the Dark Ages, that people were just, filth, filth, Actually, probably Monty Python before Blackadder. And I said, but no, like, children carved toys and, like, they had imaginations and things like this. It's interesting, actually, that childhood imagination may actually be robbed through the era of video games, whereas in the Dark Ages it was still very vibrant and a matter of hope. And it's wonderful, actually, to cultivate. I mean, it seems very curious to even have a conversation about whether modern children have imaginations as they had a generation before. But what you seem to be indicating is that the muscle memory is still there, but it just may not be exercised as much as it was with, my generation or your generation.
Well, I think the desire to create and imagine is always there, and kids use the tools they have. And, in places where you grow up, where you have less, you still do the same thing with what you have. It's interesting because my working life is archaeology, and the particular archaeology in North America was such that very, very little of the material culture remains. It's things made of stone, sometimes bone and wood, but not commonly, because of course they deteriorate over time. So we have no idea whether children had toys as we know them, for example. And yet, when I talk about this with the public or with new staff members, I always make the point, it's inevitable. They must have had toys. There's something that they would have done. Even if we never find anything, I kind of know in my heart, even though this is a scientific pursuit, that they would have made things to engage with, to help create with. They would have had their own version of D&D minis.
Yes, I thought there were Native American childhood artifacts. Maybe in the past 400 odd years that have survived, but I certainly, in my mind's eye, I see dolls and things made out of cloth, and I mean, these things exist, right?
Those are sort of things at the interface of contact. But when we're looking at least here where I live, the pre-contact history goes back, at least 10,500 years. So, but most of that time we don't have much from except for stone tools. So it's hard to know.
Are the small arrows or things like that? I thought there were artifacts that indicated that, children were given smaller hunting implements, just if nothing more to kind of feign hunting. I mean, I thought those artifacts existed at least.
It's certainly a popular theory, and when we find very small points and other tools which seem like they would fit only a small hand, that is one of the things we suspect. But small points were also used for very small weapons, for killing small game potentially. So we don't know for sure, but it's hard to imagine that kids were not given things to emulate adult life and prepare them for adult life. So it's probably true.
Certainly.
I have an interesting thing I wanted to raise with you, Tom, having listened to some of the conversations also with Mr. Abbott. And in regards to especially rules, one thing that's always interested me is the interface of role-playing games with values of the past and values of the present, and how these end up getting resolved or not resolved in rule systems. Anyone who would care to can go onto the web, for example, and find articles from the recent or distant past about women in role-playing having poor experiences with their groups. and encountering sexism and a variety of worse behaviors. And D&D itself has been fairly accused of presenting certain value systems.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that has interested me at the time when I first got into D&D, and I've noticed, and I think it's generally the case for a lot of systems, is they don't get into the issue of male and female differences.
Mm.
And this is something presumably that most people who design a rule set or change a rule set consider at some point. D&D never suggested that women couldn't have the same strength maximum as males. Now that may be irrelevant in non-human races. They're only pretend anyway. But in human races, I mean, there's a lot of science to suggest that women can't attain the same upper body manual strength as men.
Mm.
And but yet there was never that limitation in the game.
You need to meet my wife. She was a childhood wrestling champion. I mean, my perspective is that while physiologically there are movements towards certain extremes, that doesn't mean that works if you have a very particular perspective associated with physiology. But there are a wide variety of examples of women that possess substantial strength. I mean, some of it is associated with groups in particular areas. But I think actually, I mean, what's fascinating even historically is that there are a number of examples of women who are, well accomplished warriors, and many of whom, lead groups from
certainly, absolutely
down. I think the physiology aspect, while it is there, what you're dealing with in role-playing is associated with aspirational qualities as much as everyday life. And for that reason, there's also a kind of curious gender dysmorphia where men will play women and women will play men in role-playing. I did a podcast called This Comes Next with Jay Kimona, who's the co-host. And she had a long history of role-playing, particularly in San Francisco and Oakland, where, people played reverse roles. And certainly as a boy, I always had male friends that would play female characters. And when I started playing with, I wouldn't call them women, I mean, 14-year-old girls and these kind of people that would occasionally be thrown in, they oftentimes would play men as well. I think, anyway, I'll let you continue, but I just wanted to pause.
Certainly, and most of my online gaming characters, when I create them, are women, and same for my son, which is interesting. But I always appreciated that the game never tried to get into that. It didn't try to get into assigning values based on gender, and I don't know of a game system which has really touched that, and which I think is good. Whether there are in fact sex-based differences, I'm glad that it's beside the point. Game systems tend to leave that for racial differences, like dwarves getting +2 constitution, that sort of thing, right?
But the nature of a profession is a very important thing, and I think the nature of the way role-playing, be they fighters, thieves, magic users, what have you, that is a choice based on a variety of things. The female fighter is going to come there in part through, physical attributes that they have either cultivated or have naturally. So I think the nature of it is interesting because I think certainly I can't think of any rule system that actively, I'm trying to think if the Sabida rules call it out. Certainly, I can't think of any rule system that actively calls out these kind of distinctions. I think maybe second edition AD&D might have had some descriptions just associate, but that I seem to recall the dwarves and the half-orcs had various advantages as female characters, but I don't have, the rules are probably more than arm's length away for me to actually go through. But I seem to recall that I have seen a rule set now, and it kind of feels like second edition AD&D in my mind's eye, where they were called out, but only to show very basic limitations between these things. And always you could have a half-orc female character if you wanted, certain advantages through that. So, yes, I think it's what I thought you were going to talk about when you started this was not associated with gender, but associated with, how will one even put it? So the difference that I find between British role-playing games and American role-playing games is associated with a kind of utopian vision of the past that exists in American-style fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And in the British-style role-playing, it's very much associated with filth, survival, class hierarchy, all these kind of things, which I always found very beautiful in the British systems that I'd read, in stark contrast to, AD&D and this kind
And
of
that is
stuff.
exactly where I was going with
Very
this point
good.
ultimately, which is that as a GM, for example, it's sometimes left to the GM to bring the world to the table. In part because people defer to the GM because they're the person who's going to put in a lot of work. So we understand that you're going to bring some of your vision, and in doing this. Sometimes we borrow a world, we go and buy it out of a book, and sometimes we make it up ourselves, and usually we make some kind of compromise between the two. But all of those issues have to be considered at some point. And what interests me is to know more about the experiences of women role players, because I've certainly read about poor experiences that come ultimately from the players. Behaving inappropriately. But I also want to think about it more in more abstract terms. When we look at the past and how we try to recreate it, in certain games, like Ars Magica, if you use the system and the setting that the game comes with, it is meant to be realistic Middle Ages Europe. And it is expected that when you step outside, you are surrounded by the church and feudal society and very, very, very low status for women. And you play within that. And so people would do that knowing that that's the thing, and you're okay with working with it. When you're in someone's created world, though, they tend to be, as you say, a bit more utopian. And what interests me is how women in particular respond to that. This idea that they might be playing in a world where the status of women, and if they're playing a female character or even just experiencing the world, is worse, even worse than it is in contemporary society. And how is that a confrontation? So something else they have to experience. They've worked all day. It's worked all week. It comes Friday nights, the gaming session, and some guy's going to drag them through the patriarchy again. Right?
I think it's interesting.
Of their female character going into the world,
Certainly.
entering into a pub and being treated poorly, and being assessed for her appearance, and so on and so forth. And that we end up just, maybe this is one of the reasons why fewer women get drawn into or stay in role-playing games, maybe because it's them having to re-experience stuff that isn't fun to begin with.
Certainly. I mean, my experience just with the group at work has been that more often than not, unfortunately, you have a kind of alpha male element. However, in terms of just talking and, not letting people speak and this kind of stuff, you have to kind of quieten these things and work around them. However, we have had a female player who completely owned the system, proposed various gambling games of which, she previously explicit, and then basically robbed other players quite profoundly through the game to kind of quieten everyone in the process. I was actually, and she had never role-played previously. She just came to this thing. She realized that the rules were made up in some regard. And she's like, well, I've got my rules here. Here are my rules for this thing. Are you all agreeing? Yes, okay, let's play this thing. And it was amazing to see, because certainly, as you say, we've had female players as well that have come to this thing and realized these are just drunk men behaving badly, which unfortunately is the, worst possible case scenario. But then, we've had this other female player that came in and immediately just understood that this was just a new plane for her to, understand and exploit. So I think what's interesting here is how you frame this thing as a GM. Because ultimately what you want is the best possible experience for all your players, irrespective of where they come to, irrespective of whether they played forever or played not once before. And I'm certainly very sensitive, at least to the notion that everyone should have a contributive turn within this thing. And this is the first kind of standard bad alpha male behavior that, that overtalk and people will not allow people to say their piece in these circumstances. And you get, visually, as a GM, you notice this very quickly, because sadly we have these other devices. People start looking at their other devices. They're not engaged in the game. So it's my responsibility to make sure that people are engaged at every level. And I think, certainly, as you say, there is so much complexity within this existing, society, just here in the present day. But the way in which you cultivate not just fairness, but almost affirmative action within this is important. I think
agree.
the GM can play a very important role to level this thing out. Moreover, as I've noted with regards to this notion that a female fighter is not just, a woman that puts on armor, it's a profession that has been cultivated as a female thief, is a profession that has been cultivated as a male thief, etc. So within this, I think the character has to be empowered that irrespective of whatever baggage exists in the contemporary world and potentially whatever baggage exists in the historical world, if you read heavily, and my wife does, and I read based on her reading, associated with famous women through history, it is amazing how counterbalances of power can be used even in extremely rigid and repressive environments. So it's true that what you're dealing with here may be a small fraction of a percent of people historically, but thankfully we have the ability in these games to create these environments where these historical figures or what have you, the strengths that they had, can be exploited through the game as well. Now, as you noted, this is slightly more difficult in certain circumstances. But I think the purpose of the GM is to make sure that every player has an ability to enjoy themselves at each of the games. Now, as you note, there are problems, there are conflicts, there are decisions, there's tension, there's dice rolling, there's a bunch of stuff going on as well. But I think certainly as I've played it, there have been a couple of circumstances, particularly with the game at work. In individual incidents, people have taken certain things poorly. And what I've done through those times is gone back, talked to the individuals involved, reaffirmed that the purpose of the game is actually to have, fun and not to create these circumstances. But you have to be very mindful, particularly if you play in a professional setting, that there are certain topics and certain ideas and certain framings that just probably should be avoided. But I do agree with this idea of role-playing as a means of empowerment. Mm-hmm. And I think within that, you have a broad ability for characters, let's not say people, but characters of any possible perspective to have a role to play in the game, which would be fulfilling and ultimately, as you say, lead them to come back game after game and enjoy the experience. In a person-by-person basis, it's more interesting. And as characters come with their own personal baggage, people are, I don't even view the spectrum hypothesis of introvert, extrovert, what have you. I think everyone is unique in this thing. And the role of the GM is to draw out characters that may not be as, explicitly talking in your face always, and also perhaps reduce the reverse, so to speak. But yeah, it's a dynamic which the GM needs to be very well aware of.
I agree, and one of the things that I do when a session ends is I always look back and I try to reassure or tell myself, I ask myself and I think back on, did I give everyone a chance to shine?
Mm.
Did I give, and I don't just mean that on their, in terms of using their character's skills. Did I give something for the rogue? Did we have a moment for the fighter to be toe-to-toe? But also did the player get a chance to shine, the chance to speak as much as that person would like to. Some people are naturally quieter, and I have to respect that. That certainly, and sometimes, at the end of a session, I've gone back and you know what? I didn't give, the material was too heavily sided towards combat, or it was too, there was too much space taken up by this person, and I didn't do enough to redistribute the airtime. I hope we have, or you have, it's your program, some female listeners as well. And would love them to contact you and
Certainly.
and give their input on this matter.
Certainly.
It would be terrific to hear.
Certainly. Well, I have to go, unfortunately. So this recording...
All good things, Tom. All good things
have to come to an end. And believe me, this thing has been simmering for about 4 hours now. So this is a very good thing that I'm looking forward to consuming this evening. But I did want to say, I was hoping this discussion to discuss the moral turpitude that is miniature painting. We will need to save that for the next recording, Matthew.
We shall. I look forward to it.
It was great having the chance to catch up with Matthew. Let us talk a little bit associated with stuff relating to My Rules Are Better. So folks may remember I was in the UK early February, from about the 1st, I think, through to about the 8th. I went to the UK primarily to open a bank account. Didn't actually end up opening the bank account, but had a lot of fun otherwise, some of which the audio is in the My Rules Are Better feed. So I'm going back to the UK in August, the end of August, and on August 31st, I'm going to be at Fighting Fantasy Fest 3, which is at the University of West London. So the reason I'm going back to the UK is not only to open a bank account, but also meet Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. These are two gentlemen who created Games Workshop. In fact, they created many, many, many different pieces of fantasy intellectual property, starting with Fighting Fantasy, obviously GURPS, it's a Steve Jackson game, a bunch of different things that have come through these two gentlemen. I'm having a curry, an Indian meal with them, and then I'm going to Fighting Fantasy Fest to tag along on their coattails as the guests of honor. So it's going to be absolutely wonderful to be back in the UK. I've already got a little miniature case that I'm ready to take to Orc's Nest. I think I'm going to stay pretty well centrally in London for most of the trip, but I might get to Bovington, which is a tank museum, which is a site that I wanted to see, or have wanted to see for many years, even back when I lived in the UK, but just haven't had a chance to. So I might take a day trip out to Bovington and also just enjoy being back in London. So the UK trip, the previous one, has taken a bit of my energy, which has slowed down the recording of podcasts, but I did want to put that out there that I will be meeting Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, and my hope is that I will have a discussion with them and maybe in the future, potentially, invite them onto this very podcast to have a chat, these kind of things. So we'll see how we get along. I've had some correspondence with Ian Livingstone so far. I seem to get along via email communication. So let's see what happens in the UK in August, and maybe they will make guest appearances on the podcast going forward. Who can tell? Hard to predict, but I'd like to meet them both first. So we have a list of questions from listener Mike King. And I'm just going to get into these questions. I'm going to read them out. I'm going to talk a little bit about them. And I think that will be this particular episode of My Rules Are Better. Mike King writes, Fantasy Wargaming versus Historic. Most of the discussion so far has been around historic wargaming rules. Is there a significant difference between fantasy and historic? I think there would be a lot more work involved in coming up with a coherent set of fantasy rules, since there is nothing to build on. I'm thinking of issues like magic, breaking the world, which comes up a lot. Mike, I don't necessarily feel that we've been talking about historic. I would call it historical, but maybe that's just some speech impediment. Anyway, I don't feel we've really been talking that much about historical wargaming, aside from talking about the Chechen rule set. And I think basically you can go in two different lines. I mean, obviously, if you're writing a historical rule set, you need to know a bit about the history. You need to understand how certain battles worked, how certain dynamics worked. Ideally, you would playtest actual battles, maybe with an opponent. Hard to say. But, you'd have these kind of parameters. You'd need to understand which are battle-hardened troops. You'd need to understand some of the dynamics. Obviously, the weapons, ranges, this kind of stuff, the movement, all these things in a historical system requires a certain amount of study and thorough review. Now, obviously, you could just put out a rule system and, just ethereally move the miniatures around and call it a kind of historical miniature game, I guess. But ideally, and as a listener to this particular podcast, I would hope that you would go into the history and understand how these dynamics might actually change the rule system. Fantasy, on the other hand, yes, all possibilities of breaking. This is why playtesting is absolutely fundamental. But you do have the ability to actually create the setting down to a description of almost minutiae. You could talk about the nature of the feudal lands. You could talk about serfdom. You can do a wide variety of different things to construct an environment that players can immerse themselves in, but alternatively, you can just start with a rule system and then write the history afterwards. if you look at, we discussed Games Workshop briefly, if you look at the Warhammer series of rules, the history and stuff came after it. The rule set was there first, some initial narrative and other things around that, but then the history, the actual written stuff associated with this thing, be it Warhammer or Warhammer 40,000, came after the initial rules. So the notion of either you have the history first and then the rules, or the rules first and then a created history in the case of fantasy and science fiction, this is there. Now, my wife, for whatever reason, I think she's read the Aliens series of books recently, insisted that we go back and watch the Aliens films. And I am a huge fan of H.R. Giger. I think he is, or was, let us say, an amazing artist with such a unique insight into aspects of humanity, mechanization, evil, darkness, all these kind of things. So, big fan of Aliens. Obviously, also like the Gene Stealers in Warhammer 40,000 and all this kind of stuff. I like this organic stuff that comes from H.R. Giger. So, in that circumstance, you have an existing history that comes through books, from films, obviously from an artist's work. So you have something to construct around that as well. Now, there is a game based on the Alien series. In fact, I think there are multiple games based on the Alien series. So you can actually buy the aliens here, Space Marines. You can actually buy the various aliens and these kind of things in miniature form. The second-hand market on this is pretty bold. But when you have a created science fiction history, you have to adhere to that as well in the rule system. Obviously, for example, we talked historically about the Robotech rules. The Robotech rules were based on an interesting combination of a couple of, well, 3, in fact, anime films loosely cobbled together. So there's going to be a potential, even in the case of fantasy, to have some prior to game element that you have to base the rule system on. But honestly, I don't think there are significant differences between the two. I mean, obviously, you've got things like magic and what have you. But I mean, in terms of game elements, the way that you approach it is distinctly dependent on the setting. If the setting is World War II, or if the setting is Dark Age Wessex, these have certain elements there. And as you want to add things like magic, as you want to add things like occult or psychic powers, or these kind of things which are also elements that one might add to a game, these are, additions that fit into a narrative. So I guess my point is, you could create a rule set with no narrative. You could create a narrative without a rule set, obviously. But when you put the two of those things together, the narrative and the rule set becomes pretty heavily intertwined. And if the history existed before the rule set, then you're just going to have to make sure that the rule set feels like it's intertwined with the history, if that makes some sense. Fantasy, similarly, you can define the fantasy after you've written the rule set, but if you have the fantasy, or if you can work on the fantasy in parallel with the rule set, then you'll probably get something out of it as well. Think about my discussion with Matthew and his card game associated with the Goblin Raiders. Think about that. That's an embodiment of some degree of prior rationale associated with what these Goblin Raiders were. Obviously, the players have a sense of what goblins are, in a kind of fantasy sense, but a lot of the other things associated with their hierarchies, how they actually raid cities, how they raid towns, how they gather wealth, how they contribute wealth in a coherent, I don't know what one would call it, kind of feudal system. These are all things that are defined by Matthew through the game. So, I don't know if I've answered Mike King's question, but I don't think there is a significant difference aside from the fact that you have potential to add things like magic and psychic powers and stuff which don't exist in the real world, but have an ability to be translated to rules which are pretty similar to terror, okay? If you can imagine a whole bunch of huge naked barbarians flailing themselves at you, there's a certain element of terror in that, and the way in which that is represented is akin, not identical, not, the same thing, but akin to notions of magic in some fundamental sense. So my view is that history is actually considerably more magical than we would let it normally be if you understand it in true context, because the central normalcy, particularly as we exist in, our 2000 and something selves, that is as much a fabrication of psychological worldwide systematization, the internet as a thing, English as a spoken language. All these kind of concepts are additive to our base humanity. And I think it's interesting, actually, that you start talking about almost reality metaphysics as you explore these game topics. I'll move that one aside. We'll talk about that one at a later date. Mike King goes on to say, are space-based movement rules inherently boring? I did some playtesting of my simple movement combat rules, and I found it very boring. Well, I'm not a huge fan of grids. I'm not a huge fan of hexes. I'm not a big fan of something that doesn't allow for organic multi-directional movement. And I think in general, a bad movement system can easily be gamed. I use here the example of Blood Bowl, the most recent edition, and also the earlier editions. The movement particularly associated with passing and tackling is a dimension hack. It's a practicality of the nature of squares and grids, and practically it really just dominates the game in a very curious way. So I would say for a game like Blood Bowl, the fact that it is set out on squares is indicative of game mechanics which almost work against the game. So, yes, I'm very much against the grid religion here, and my view is that if you put a grid down, it's going to create dynamics that are unintended and not particularly desirable. The notion of moving diagonally in any given circumstance is always slightly curious because you're actually covering slightly more ground. So I wouldn't say inherently boring. I would say just, let's use the word boring. Why not, Mike King? I think maybe inherently boring is just a good way of saying what I'm trying to find. How important is context early on in designing rules? Would this have helped with my playtesting issues? Always being a sticking point for my game development efforts, but after listening to the podcast, I realized it might not be needed. What I find so interesting about playtesting is the idea that you put forth just testing the mechanics and not needing the narrative. So, yes, we did talk a little bit about this associated with the fantasy versus historical wargaming aspect, but my perspective is that context here, I think Mike is referring to background story, explanation of setting, all these other kinds of things. That, I think, adds a certain flavour to things. And certainly when I play games, particularly games that I've created with a broader group of people, the ability to add context oftentimes smooths over, let us just say, smooths over some of the rough edges and gives an ability for people to become immersed in the game system without being overly concerned about the rough edges in the game play, if that makes some sense. So my view is that context is useful. When you play test rules, however, this is considerably more clinical than when you play in a group with people. When you're playtesting rules, you're really looking at game mechanics. So my view is that context, if context here means narrative and other stuff around game mechanics, that shouldn't really help you with playtesting, per se. Like, if the movement is inherently boring, you probably need to change the movement. But I think I need more information from Mike King on this one specifically. Anyway, Mike King goes on to talk about single-player wargaming. I've heard about these. I'd be interested to hear you talk about how to design paper-based AI for something like this. So, in another life, many years ago, more than 20 years ago now, I wrote a book called The Original Manuals of Noble Ape. And in the Original Manuals of Noble Ape, I talk about movement and how simple AI movement is from very basic rules. Most movement is simulated movement in terms of the notion that you have a goal which can be specified, and you simulate movement towards that goal. So a goal can be specified on a piece of paper. You could have a card system with half a dozen different goals, and you can move these goals and change the movement. Sorry, you can switch between these goals. Let's avoid using the word move here. You can switch between these goals and tailor the movement to the goals as they change. And it actually produces a very natural form of movement. So if you're playtesting something and you want to simulate what it is to have multiple players, write down on a piece of paper 6 different goals in the game and maybe give a weighting to these, like there are 3 immediate goals and 3 secondary goals. So then move through the goals in perhaps order for the primary goals, and then give the option to move between the secondary goals out of order or in some random order. And then you can start testing how various dynamics actually come into play. This goal strategy system is a very easy way to simulate movement, particularly if you're just playing by yourself. You will find in a number of game rules they have notions of activation, which means that you have very similar system, except you have cards which are activation cards, which get the various entities in the game, the various, models or what have you, to move around based on things that come up over time. And you have these activation cards, which then mean, this squad over here can start moving, or this squad over here can move in a certain way. So you can actually, to use Mike King's term, create an AI based on cards to identify these goals and then playtest with that. You can also do tree goals, which means that you have a series of possible goals and you just traverse through the trees and you play, 6, 10, 15 games with the view that each of these games goes through a different tree of the goals, and you can see how the dynamics come into play with the view that really what you're testing here is the rolling of dice and the movement and these kind of things. You're testing, is this game fun? Is this game entertaining? Is this game something that, will reward players who participate in this? And the AI component, the intelligence or the movement strategy, can be removed from just, you being you, playing you, all this kind of stuff can be removed from that if you use cards in one case, but also if you use perhaps a traversing tree. So for the Just Playing Chaos rules, it's something concrete here. There were 9 different interactions, a 3x3 matrix that I wanted to determine, associated with, large number of combatants, small number of combatants. Cover was the other dimension, and I wanted to play these things out to see how the game would play in circumstances where players used cover, where players didn't use cover, where players incorporated movement into their firing rounds, these kind of things. Could describe that not in a tree in this case, but in a matrix of possibilities, and just went through one by one, rolling the dice, playing it out, seeing what the results were, seeing how powerful certain players were with certain, levels of experience and this kind of stuff, just to try and work out whether the gameplay actually worked. So yes, there are a number of different ways you can simulate AI in, designing on paper, as Mike King puts. But I think that's certainly the 2 methods that I've used, is tree or matrix-based AI, and then card activation, which I think is a great way to represent more complex goals. So if you have maybe 4 or 5 goals in a game, you can use card activation and perhaps proximity-based card activation. So, you have 3 cards in this area, 4 cards in that area. As they are interacting on the first set, maybe they stray into the second set's activation area and you get cards that are activated accordingly. So some ideas for Mike King in terms of his playtesting. Mike King also asks, light wargaming, lunchtime skirmish system, can short games be quality? Purposeful, simplified rules, can it be engaging enough for a certain class of wargamer? I'm thinking along the lines of simple rock, paper, scissors rules here. It doesn't have to be rock, paper, scissors. My perspective is actually you can have rules that can exist on 2 pages. I mean, if you look at the Just Playing Chaos rules, but they're basically 2 pages worth of rules, maybe 2.5 pages. You can, on 2 pages, have quite a bit of complexity and still have a rule system which I think is quite reasonable. There have been various iterations through Warhammer 40,000 and now a variety of smaller, skirmish games based in the fantasy universe, now called Age of Sigmar, in the Games Workshop, range, what have you, that have been specifically designed for 40 minutes or so. And what's interesting, particularly in the Warhammer 40,000 adaptation early on for the 40 minutes or so game, was how well they stripped the rules apart. This was actually done by non-Games Workshop people. This existed originally as an online community that then Games Workshop absorbed and wrote a lot about and then forgot about and then produced different rule systems for them and this kind of stuff. So this lunchtime playing, 5 to 10 figures aside, this kind of wargaming is certainly something that I think is very inspiring. And now actually Games Workshop is going back and doing that with a kind of kill team rule set, which is based in the 40,000 universe, with the view that people can then collect half a dozen models and, paint them up to a certain level of detail. Don't have to have, 150 different Space Marines and get away with 6, right? So this genre of games, the fast lunchtime games, do not have to be super simple. They can have a level of complexity that, can build on a variety of existing IP, as the Games Workshop, Kill Team game does. but at the same point can be just as nurturing and just as exciting and just as interesting for a wide variety of players. And certainly Necromunda and these kind of rules, the Games Workshop space is like that as well. There are a bunch of other game systems, a bunch of other companies that do this too. Apologies if I seem like a GW fanboy here. This is just the main company that I follow with these rules. And obviously you've got Malifaux, War Machine, Hordes, all these other games that are based on a similar kind of size, maybe slightly longer time frame, but certainly can be played in the shorter term. I think also both Flames of War and the Bolt Action rule set have short game rules as well. So be it just with tanks or these kind of things, there are a wide variety of ways that people can shorten games for lunchtime play. Thank you, Mike King. So if you have questions like Mike, if you want to get in contact, my surname Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango @gmail.com, barbale@gmail.com is the way to contact me. My hope is that I will be recording podcasts with both Chris Abbott and Mathew Gibson coming up shortly. Apologies for the delay in those. Apologies also for the delay in the Mathew Gibson edited podcast. Thank you to listener Mike King for submitting questions. I'll take all kinds of questions, and I think in the solo recordings that I've got coming up, I would like to talk a little bit more about the Chechen rules. I'd like to talk a little bit more, potentially also, about an American Civil War rule set, and a little bit behind that. Let me just open this up. Let me just explain this to the listeners. I'm currently sitting in my podcasting room. My wife is away. She's in Vancouver for about 5-6 days. I sent a bunch of Chechen miniatures off to get painted. My assumption is that they will return in a kind of June time frame, painted to some standard, which will be nice. However, in the absence of that, I packed and unpacked a bunch of different miniatures and found that I have 2 complete armies of American Civil War winter gear, which is a subset of the American Civil War. Winter gear. I've got Union soldiers, I've got Confederate soldiers, I've got cannons, I've got some horse, not a lot of horse. So it's mainly skirmish games. But these miniatures are highly detailed, and they are a Kickstarter that I have squirreled away into my closet of doom. So bringing them out of the closet of doom, looking at them and getting a sense of, gee, I've got these things too in there. So a big cleanup while my wife is out. A lot of stuff donated to charity, but the end of that process will be getting, and these are 28mm. I also have 15mm American Civil War figures squirreled away as well. They're a little bit close at hand. Well, actually, they're all close to hand now. But these things may be addressing the discussion of the problem of holding miniatures for too long. So we will talk a little bit about that in an upcoming recording, but I wanted to explore American Civil War history and also rules around that period of time in an upcoming recording. Stay tuned. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.